Thanks for watching. Let's talk about bed bugs. Bed bugs are an obligate parasite. They're an arthropod. They feed exclusively on blood. Here in the United States, there's only one type of bed bug. It's called Cymex lectularius. It's also referred to as the bat bug or the swallow bug. Cymex means bug. The lectularius means couch or bed. In the tropics, it's Cymex hemipterus. We've had an increasing problem of late, but not nearly as bad as it was back prior to the 1950s. Part of the problem now is increasing population density, greater ease of travel nationally, internationally. We've banned certain of the insecticides. The organisms have become resistant to other insecticides, and now we're spending a lot of attention getting rid of cockroaches that are actually the natural predator of the bed bugs. We've known about bed bugs for 3,500 years. They used to live in caves and fed on bats and humans. They were widely disseminated and brought to the Americas by the explorers. Up until the mid-1800s, they were used for medicinal purposes, often to treat hysteria. They were so common that by the 1950s, about 1 in 3 homes here in the United States had bed bugs, and the estimates are that on a routine basis, about 4 million Londoners were bitten by bed bugs. Seemed like it was an inevitable problem up until the mid to early 1900s, and then we started to develop some insecticides. So there was a marked decline from the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s. But now recently there's been an exponential rise in its epidemic proportions in certain of the large cities, like in Baltimore and Washington, Chicago and Los Angeles and New York City. It's difficult to identify exactly how widespread the problem is, because a lot of the people who are bitten, they don't even develop any kind of symptoms. They don't know that they've been bitten. It's not a reportable disease. Probably the people who have the greatest knowledge are the local authorities and the health department and people in the pest control industry. Obviously, the hotel chains aren't reporting all of the bed bites that people get. In fact, they might not even know, because people might not develop a problem on the skin until after they're home. They might not associate the stay with the problem. But once you get one bed bug, the numbers increase exponentially. So if you have one bug in January, by March you have 500 bugs. And then by May you have just shy of 10,000 bugs. And by June you have almost 32,000 bugs. Now we call them bed bugs because they live in the beds. Yes, indeed they do. That means the mattresses and the seams and the box springs, but also on the headboards and the bed linen, bedclothes, chairs, couches, wallpaper, floorboards. They live in the curtains and the carpets. They live in electrical outlets and any kind of crevice. They live in your suitcase. They live in your luggage. They live in your book bag or your cardboard box or your dresser drawer, the joints in the drawer. They can live on the head of a screw or a picture frame. And when you get some secondhand clothes, secondhand furniture, you might be getting more than you expect. Well, they certainly can be in the home and the apartment, and they can go from apartment to apartment if we're talking about relative proximity. They can also be in condos and hotels and room rentals, but they also can be in gyms and locker rooms and cruise ships and nursing homes and shelters and hospitals and jails and military bases. They can be in refugee areas and schools and offices and even in movie theaters. The spread isn't from person to person, and it's not related to the hygiene or the social class. But yes, indeed, as we get more dense population seems to be a problem, and also travelers and vacationers seem to be very frequently affected. But by the time we identify a person has a problem with bed bugs, then chances are we have a secondary, even maybe a tertiary site that's involved. The organisms can migrate either passively, you can carry them around in your clothes or your luggage or your book bags, or they move around a lot, they can walk. And they do that, and they can go through the wall spaces and ventilation areas or electrical wiring, the conduits. They can spread. They typically live within about 8 feet of an individual, but in the course of a night they can travel up to about 100 feet. They're more common in the hot months of the year, September, June through September, somewhat less frequent in January, February, and March. If you look carefully at the bed linen, you oftentimes see little dark spots. Those dark spots may be the fecal deposits of blood. They have a sweaty smell, oftentimes when they're in significant numbers. If you wake up and you set your alarm, say 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, if you lift up the bed linen and you shine a bright flashlight, you might be able to see them moving around. That's when they come out at night. Now, 20 to 70% of the people who are bitten by bed bugs have absolutely no skin reaction. Maybe you could see a little visible puncture site, but typically you don't. The bites are identical to any other arthropod bite. When they appear, it's just a little tiny red dot on the skin. It tends to be itchy, but it tends not to occur immediately at the time of the bite because it's a delayed hypersensitivity reaction, so it could take hours to a couple days until the eruption appears, and the eruption tends to change over a period of time, especially if you happen to scratch at it. New lesions can form as old lesions heal. A lesion itself takes about 5 to 7 days to heal. They typically develop in threes, 3 little dots in a row. They call them breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nonspecific nature of the bite, so it's very difficult to make the diagnosis. By the way, your pets can be affected too, your dogs and your cats. The bite reaction isn't to the puncture itself. It's due to your body's immune reaction to some of the protein that's in the bug's saliva. It's a delayed hypersensitivity reaction. So at night you don't get the rash. It might be present in the morning, or it might be present after a few days. On second and third time exposure, maybe it's a shorter time between the bite and the onset of the eruption. Sometimes the eruption can look like hives or papular urticaria. Sometimes it's just an itchy rash, and you scratch at it, and then because you scratch at it so much, you might develop some impetigo or some cellulitis. And if 2 people are sleeping in the same bed, one person might be allergic, the other not. So even though both people are bitten, that doesn't mean that both people are going to develop the eruption. Where do the bugs bite? They tend to like to bite on exposed skin. So that means they like your face, especially your eyelids. They like to bite your arms and your neck and your legs and your waist, and they like under the arms, but they seem to be less comfortable biting the covered areas of the skin. They gravitate toward warmth, and they gravitate to CO2, carbon dioxide, and to certain kind of chemicals. The bites tend not to be painful. They're not painful for the overwhelming majority of people, so they don't interrupt your sleep because the organism actually injects a little anesthetic when it bites you. But for some people, they can interrupt the sleep. Now, the question always has been, do they carry disease? And the answer is yes, they carry the vector of disease. So bed bugs can carry the hepatitis B virus or hepatitis E virus, the AIDS virus, or the organism responsible for Chagas disease. They can carry the resistant Staph aureus, methicillin resistant, or MRSA. They can carry the plague or tuberculosis. They can carry leishmania and leprosy and arboviruses, but they can't spread them. So far, in spite of the fact that we've known about bed bugs for over 3,500 years, we can't identify one single person who has been infected with one of those nasty organisms that they potentially carry. And when we look at the skin of an individual, can we tell that it's a bed bug bite? No, we can get the idea, but one bug looks kind of like another bug bite. So a flea or a tick or a louse or a mosquito all can look relatively similar, and so too can a drug eruption or a food allergy or a staph infection or chickenpox or scabies or even hives. And once you've been bitten, and once you know that that's the diagnosis, then you can have some psychological reactions. You can have some anxiety and insomnia. You're afraid to go to sleep because you think you're going to get bitten. You can have almost some post-traumatic stress. You can have some nightmares. And a lot of people develop what we call delusions of parasitosis, where anytime they feel something on the skin, they think, oh my gosh, it's another bug. And then they start to scratch. And then they come to see a physician with holes all over the skin because of their digging. Well, a lot of lawsuits over bed bugs because somebody says, well, I went and slept in your hotel and I got the bed bug, so I'm going to sue. There are actually over 90 different types of bed bugs, but most of them feed on bats or birds or mammals. But as I mentioned, only two species seem to be relatively common in humans, the Cymex lectularius and the Cymex hemopterus. Well, if we look at the bugs look like typical bugs. They have some wings, but they don't fly. They have a particular smell, so that if there are large numbers of the organisms, they smell like rotting raspberries, or it has a musty smell. So much so that actually dogs have been trained to identify the smell with pretty significant accuracy. Once the egg is laid, then it takes 5 nymphal stages to get to be an adult over the time period of about 5 to 6 weeks. Now, it could be slowed down a little bit if it happens to be really cold, and each nymphal stage has to feed before it can get to the next nymphal stage. So we have significant feeding. Now, the male organism passes its sperm through traumatic insemination, and that's how the female gets pregnant, so to speak, and then she can actually leave and set up her own harborage with her own eggs, and once they develop, then she can mate with them. Well, a female who's been mated only once actually produces about 25 more eggs than a female after multiple reproductions. Sometimes the women, or the female bugs, actually, because of the traumatic insemination, they just leave and say, not up for this kind of stuff. The bug itself, well, it's about the size of an appleseed. Measures about 4 or 5 millimeters long, maybe about 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters wide. Nymph is the size of a sesame seed, and the excrement is the size of a period on a sentence. The action of the bed bug, when it bites, it injects a little bit of anesthetic, and then it injects a little bit of anticoagulant and some other kind of chemicals. The feeding time is somewhere between 3 and 30 minutes, average about 10 minutes. During the feeding, the organism increases in length by about 50%, increases in weight by about 200%, doubles in weight. It feeds about every 3 to 7 days. The preferred time of feeding is between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning, tends to hide from the light. The organisms tend to feed when they're stressed. They look for the host, they look for the warmth, they look for the CO2. They wander around aimlessly until they're about 3 feet away, and that's when they detect the carbon dioxide. Then they directly move to the host, then they feed, then they leave the host. So even though we think of them as obligate parasites, they don't live on the people. They only feed on the people, and shortly thereafter they're gone. Certainly they don't like light. They live in clusters or harborages with the adults and the nymphs and the eggs. They're not attracted by dirt. They do find clutter appropriate hiding spaces, so that's one of the reasons you ought to keep your room kind of nice, kind of neat. And overall, the lifespan can be anywhere up to about 6 to 12 months. Now, that's in the laboratory. When the animals are fully satiated, they can have actually a year with just one meal. They can live in cooler climates for 2 years with just one meal. But the male is starved after about 2 weeks and won't mate. In the real world, the organisms live for about 5 to 6 months. Most of them die from dehydration rather than from starvation. And if we look at the old days, where it was cold and where they didn't have central heating like in London, in the old days, then the organism tended to live a lot longer. Now the organisms live for a relatively short period of time. The color of the organism tends to be a reddish hue, especially after a meal. The nymphs are sort of a whitish yellow. They can't fly and they can't jump, but they can run relatively rapidly, especially in warm temperature, but they usually live within about 8 feet of the individual. The female organism lays about 3 to 8 eggs each week, usually in a hidden location, in a crevice somewhere, in a dark and protected area where the organisms congregate. We call them the harborage. Over the course of a lifetime of a female bedbug, she could lay as many as 500 eggs, but typically it's only between about 100 and 150. The eggs hatch after a period of about 5 to 10 days. They produce the same number of male and female eggs. The hatch rate is significant. It's about 95% of all eggs are going to develop. How do you prevent them? Well, if you go into a hotel room, you kind of look around. You can pull up the bedclothes and actually look at the seams in the mattress. If you have your clothes, instead of putting them in the drawers, you hang them, or you take your suitcase and you put it on a luggage rack, or you can take the suitcase and you can actually put it in the bathtub. Unlikely to be infected there. And if you have secondhand clothes or secondhand furniture, you look very carefully. Now the treatment, remember, the bugs don't live on you. They don't live on the person. So the treatment for the skin, if you happen to have a rash, you go treat the rash. Maybe an oral antihistamine might help, or maybe a little topical cortisone cream. And if you've picked at it too much, you might have a secondary infection, so you might need a little topical antibiotic, but that typically is enough. And some people, if they develop an anaphylactic type reaction, then maybe a shot of epinephrine would be appropriate. But you have to first identify that indeed bedbug is indeed the problem, and then you can go to figuring out what to do. Well, you wash the linen regularly, you wash the bedspreads, you wash the blankets. You have any clothing that touches the floor should be washed. Heads up that the organism can live in the laundry containers or the hampers. You have to wash the clothes in hot water. Now there's the idea that you can heat the room or chill the room and kill the organisms, but that's not practical as far as your ability to do that. That takes professional care. If you are trying to look around the room, well, one, you get rid of clutter because they have just extra areas in which they can live. You vacuum the floors, you vacuum the bed, you vacuum the mattress. And you should do that probably pretty regularly, oftentimes daily for a while. And then you take all of the refuse and you put it in a plastic bag and get rid of it. You take it out of the house. Your clothes, well, you could wash the clothes, but you could also put the clothes in a plastic bag, and especially in the summertime, if you leave it outside, then it gets hot enough so it's able to kill the bugs, or you can put the clothes in the freezer, and if you do that and keep them there for several days at less than 0 degrees, that also kills the bug. You have to realize that bed bugs tend to live more in the bedrooms and the dens that have sofas than they do in other rooms of the house. So don't throw away the bed, and don't move into a different room, because the bugs are going to probably travel with you. If you have a mattress, where you can go and encase the mattress and the box spring in a special material that you can get online, or you can get at Target, you can get at Walmart. You can put the legs of the bed in what are known as interceptors that you can easily buy. These interceptors are little cup-like material, and they're full of sticky material so that the bugs, once they get in there, can't climb up the leg of the bed. They get stuck, and you can put a little bit of talc there so they can't get out of the trap. And that seems to be relatively helpful. You don't let any of the bed clothing touch the floor. Don't let your clothes touch the floor. There are more than 300 different EPA-registered agents, mostly for consumers, that you can spray. Now, how good they are is a question, because there's a lot of resistance, and not only is there a lot of resistance, but remember, the organisms are going to be hidden in crevices that are not easy to reach with a spray. And the idea that you could use some black pepper or black cohosh or the eucalyptus oil or bean leaves to help, well, it's just not going to do it. You could develop a little trap of your own. You could take a little carbon dioxide, maybe some dry ice, and you could put a mix of sugar and yeast and water, and that sort of attracts the bugs. You could use an aerosol insecticide, but that's not going to get to the hiding spaces, and neither is an aerosol bug bomb or a fumigator or a fogger. And it's really important that you remember that since the organisms don't live on you, don't go and spray yourself. chances are you may need some professional help. There is a new agent that was developed at Penn State University just recently. It's actually a fungus, and it's known as Beauveria bassiana. That's an EPA-registered pesticide. It's used in agriculture and horticulture for several years. It doesn't affect the humans, but what it does is it's present in an oil that's sprayed about every 3 months if you have an ongoing problem. When the bugs cross them, the organism, the spores, stick to the bed bugs. Then the bed bugs go back to the harborages. The spores germinate and kill the adults within 3 to 7 days, and actually can wipe out the entire colony within several weeks. Seems to be effective about 99% within 14 days in killing the organism. And all you have to do is spray within a small area around the bed or under the sofa. And that probably is all you have to do. You don't really have to put it on the mattress or on the furniture or on the upholstery. So now you know about bed bugs. Bed bugs becoming, unfortunately, increasingly common. A lot of people who experience the bites don't even know it. They're not going to get any rash. But a lot of other people are going to get severe rashes, and they're not going to know what the cause is. And they're not going to think that they've been affected by bed bugs. And remember, the bugs live not on the individual, but they live on the mattresses and the sofas and the carpet and the dresser drawers. And remember, just because you're bitten and you have a rash doesn't necessarily mean your bedmate is going to have to get the rash. And also be extremely careful with secondhand clothes or with secondhand furniture. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let us know. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe. Maybe tell a friend. Thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.